The sun hung low over Dry Creek, painting the dusty plains in shades of amber and rust. It was the kind of evening that made the horizon blur, where earth met sky in a wavering line of heat. The town itself wasn't much to look at. A collection of weathered buildings huddled together like old men sharing secrets, their wooden facades bleached pale by years of unforgiving sun. Main Street stretched barely 200 yards, bookended by the saloon on one side and the church on the other, as if vice and virtue were keeping watch over the souls caught between them. Through this tableau of drought and desolation came the weekly stagecoach, wheels groaning under the weight of supplies and the occasional traveler foolish enough to venture into this forgotten corner of the frontier. Today, it carried something else. A stranger who would upset the delicate balance of ignorance and fear that had settled over Dry Creek like a shroud. The stranger stepped down from the coach with the easy grace of a man accustomed to long journeys. He was tall, lean in the way of men who lived by the gun and the saddle, with eyes the color of winter sky. His name was Jake Morgan, though he offered it to no one as he collected his saddlebags and made his way toward Murphy's boarding house. As Jake crossed the street, a figure caught his attention. She moved like a shadow along the buildings, keeping to the edges where the dying light couldn't quite reach. The girl, for she couldn't have been more than 20, wore a faded calico dress that had seen too many washings, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid. But it was her eyes that made Jake pause. They held a quality he'd seen before in Wild Things, alert, wary, seeing more than they should. "Get away from here, cursed girl!" The shout came from Mrs. Henderson, the grocer's wife, who stood in her doorway brandishing a broom like a weapon. "We don't need your evil eye on our goods." The girl, Grace Turner was her name, though few in town bothered to use it, simply lowered her gaze and quickened her pace. She'd heard worse, been called worse. The whispers followed her like dust devils, swirling in her wake. Witch, curse, devil's daughter. All because she sometimes knew things before they happened. All because she'd tried to warn them, time and again, only to be blamed when her visions came true. Jake watched the scene unfold with the detached interest of an outsider, but something in the girl's bearing, the straight spine despite the humiliation, the careful grace despite the hostility, stirred an old memory. He'd known another woman once who'd been branded different, dangerous. That hadn't ended well. The church bell began to toll, calling the faithful to evening service. Pastor Elijah Blackwood stood at the door, his severe face a map of righteous certainty. He was a man who dealt in absolutes, good and evil, saved and damned, blessed and cursed. His voice carried across the square as the townspeople began to gather. "Come, brothers and sisters, come and fortify your souls against the darkness that walks among us." Grace paused at the corner of the mercantile, her fingers tightening on the small bundle she carried, laundry she'd done for pennies, her only means of survival. She knew what was coming. Every Sunday it was the same. There she is. A group of children, led by the Garrett boys, began pelting her with small stones and clods of dried earth. "Witch, curse-bringer, go back to hell!" Grace raised an arm to shield her face, stumbling as a rock caught her shoulder. The bundle of clean laundry tumbled to the ground, white fabric blooming in the dust like fallen flowers. She dropped to her knees, trying to gather the soiled clothes, knowing Mrs. Patterson would refuse to pay now. "That's enough." The voice was quiet, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. Jake had moved without seeming to, placing himself between Grace and her tormentors. He didn't draw his gun, didn't need to. Something in his stance, in the way his hand rested casual-like near his holster, made the boys scatter like quail. Grace looked up, startled. No one had intervened on her behalf in... She couldn't remember how long. The stranger's face was shadowed by his hat, but she could see the firm set of his jaw, the way he stood as if he had all the time in the world. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat before bending to help her collect the scattered laundry. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "You'll only make it worse for yourself. They'll say you're tainted too." Jake's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. Wouldn't be the first time. He handed her the last of the clothes, his fingers briefly brushing hers. Name's Jake Morgan. She hesitated. Then, Grace Turner. From the church steps, Pastor Blackwood's voice rose like thunder. See how the darkness spreads. See how it seeks to corrupt even newcomers to our God-fearing town. His finger pointed accusingly at Grace. She is the curse sent upon us. Every drought, every stillborn calf, every failed crop, all can be laid at her feet. Turn away from her, good people. Turn away lest her poison seep into your souls. The congregation murmured agreement, some making signs against evil. Grace's face had gone pale, but she stood slowly, clutching the ruined laundry to her chest. I've never wished harm on anyone, she said, her voice barely carrying. I only try to— Silence! Blackwood descended the steps, his black coat billowing. You speak with the tongue of serpents. You claim to see what's coming. That's the devil's work, plain and simple. Jake had heard enough. He'd drifted from town to town for 3 years now, running from his own ghosts. And he'd seen this scene play out before. Fear dressed up as faith, cruelty masquerading as righteousness. He stepped forward, placing himself between the pastor and Grace once more. Seems to me, he said conversationally, that warning folks about danger is more Christian charity than devil's work. But then, I'm just a simple man. Maybe I don't understand the finer points of theology. Blackwood's face flushed red. And who might you be, stranger, to question a man of God? Nobody special, just someone who's seen enough to know that pointing fingers and throwing stones ain't exactly what the good book preaches. The crowd stirred uneasily. Challenging the pastor was unheard of. Blackwood drew himself up to his full height, which still left him looking up at Jake. You do well to choose your associations carefully, Mr. Morgan, and I generally do. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the tension thick as the dust in the air. Finally, Blackwood turned away. Come, faithful! Let us not be corrupted by those who consort with evil. The congregation filed into the church, shooting dark glances at both Grace and Jake, when they were alone in the square. Grace finally spoke. You shouldn't have done that. He'll make your life miserable now. Jake shrugged. Won't be staying long enough for that. He studied her face in the fading light. These visions of yours, they real? Grace's jaw tightened. Real enough that I tried to warn the Hendersons about the lightning that would strike their barn. Real enough that I told the Millers their well would run dry. Real enough that— She stopped, shaking her head. It doesn't matter. When you're right, they blame you for causing it. When you're wrong, they call you a liar. Either way, you lose. Must be a hard way to live. It's the only way I know. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. Why did you help me? He was quiet for a moment. Then, maybe because I know what it's like to be on the outside looking in. Maybe because I don't much care for bullies, whether they wear a priest's collar or not. He paused. Or maybe because something tells me this town's going to need all the warnings it can get. Grace's eyes widened slightly. You feel it too? The wrongness in the air? Jake nodded slowly. Like a storm building just over the horizon. Question is, what kind of storm? She glanced around nervously, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. I've been having dreams, fire and blood, men with dark hearts riding through the night, but every time I try to tell someone, they call you cursed. Jake finished. Yeah, I gathered that. He looked toward the church where hymns were now rising into the twilight. You got somewhere safe to stay? I have a place. It's not much, but it's mine. Good. Best you get there before the service lets out. He tipped his hat again. Evening, Miss Turner. As Grace hurried away, Jake stood alone in the square, watching her disappear into the gathering darkness. He'd come to Dry Creek looking for nothing more than a place to rest his horse and refill his supplies. But something told him he'd found more than that. The girl with the haunted eyes and the gift nobody wanted. She was either crazy or cursed, touched by God or the devil. Or maybe, just maybe, she was the only person in this sun-baked town who could see the truth. The morning sun climbed mercilessly over Dry Creek, already promising another day of blistering heat. Grace Turner was up before dawn, as always, heating water for the laundry that kept her barely fed. Her small shack sat on the outskirts of town, far enough away that the good people of Dry Creek could pretend she didn't exist, close enough that they could find her when they needed their clothes cleaned for prices that bordered on charity. She worked methodically, her hands red and raw from the lye soap, scrubbing at the stubborn stains on Mr. Dalton's shirts. The repetitive motion usually calmed her, but today her mind kept drifting to the stranger, Jake Morgan. It had been 3 days since he'd stood up for her in the square, and the town was still buzzing about it. She'd seen him around, keeping mostly to himself, but occasionally their eyes would meet across the street and he'd touch his hat brim in greeting. "Grace!" "Mrs." Murphy's shrill voice cut through the morning air. The boarding house owner stood at Grace's gate, a basket of linens in her arms and a sour expression on her face. "I need these done by tomorrow. And mind you don't go having any of your visions over my clean sheets." Grace took the basket without comment. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only made things worse. "Mrs." Murphy dropped a few coins on the fence post, less than half what she'd pay anyone else, and hurried away as if Grace's curse might be catching. The day wore on, the heat building like pressure in a steam engine. Grace had just hung the last of the washing when she felt it, that peculiar tightening in her chest that always preceded a vision. She gripped the clothesline, knuckles white, as images flooded her mind. Fire, orange flames licking at wooden walls, the smell of smoke and fear, and beneath it all, a sense of deliberate malice. When the vision passed, Grace found herself on her knees in the dust, gasping. She knew she should keep quiet, knew what would happen if she spoke up, but the image of the Murphy boarding house engulfed in flames wouldn't leave her alone. An hour later, she stood at Mrs. Murphy's back door, steeling herself. "What do you want now?" "Mrs." Murphy demanded through the screen. "The linens aren't due until—" "Please," Grace interrupted, something she never did. "Please, you must check your kitchen stove. The chimney, specifically. I had a vision. There's going to be a fire." "Mrs." Murphy's face went white, then red. "A fire? You're predicting a fire at my establishment?" Her voice rose to a shriek. "George! George! Come here!" "Mr." Murphy appeared, a portly man with tired eyes. "What's the commotion, dear?" This witch is threatening to burn down our boarding house." "I'm not threatening anything," Grace said desperately. "I'm trying to warn you. Please, just check the chimney. There's a blockage, and tonight when you stoke the stove for supper—" "Get out, Mrs." Murphy grabbed a rolling pin from the kitchen. "Get away from my property, you devil! I'll not have you cursing my home." Grace fled. "Mrs." Murphy's shouts following her down the street. By the time she reached the relative safety of her shack, half the town had heard the story, twisted in the telling. The witch had cursed the Murphy boarding house. She'd threatened to burn it down. She'd cackled with glee at the thought of innocent people burning in their beds. Jake heard the commotion from his room at Murphy's. He'd been cleaning his rifle, a ritual that helped him think. When Mrs. Murphy's voice had pierced the afternoon quiet. Through his window, he'd seen Grace's hasty retreat and the gathering crowd of townspeople, their faces ugly with fear and anger. He found Grace an hour later, sitting by the creek that had given the town its misleading name. The water was little more than a trickle now, but she sat with her feet in what remained, her face turned to the sky. "Heard you caused quite a stir," he said, settling himself on a nearby rock. Grace didn't open her eyes. "I should have kept quiet. I always tell myself I will. Next time. But then I see something terrible coming and I think, what if this time they believe me? What if this time I can help? Mrs. Murphy seems convinced you put a curse on her place." "I tried to warn her. There's something wrong with her chimney. I could see it so clearly, the creosote built up, a bird's nest blocking the flow. Tonight, when she builds up the fire for cooking. Grace shuddered. But she won't listen. They never do. Jake studied her profile, the determined set of her chin at odds with the defeat in her voice. How long have you had these visions? Since I was 12. My parents thought it was fits at first. Then, when things I said started coming true, she smiled bitterly. They left me at the church steps with a note pinned to my dress. Cursed child, it said, touched by the devil. That why Blackwood has it out for you. He took me in, at first, thought he could pray the visions away. When that didn't work, he tried other methods. Her hand moved unconsciously to her back, and Jake's jaw tightened. When those failed too, he declared me irredeemable. Been preaching against me ever since. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower. Finally, Jake stood. Come on, I'll walk you back. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He offered her his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. They were halfway back to town when they saw the smoke. Black, billowing clouds rose from the direction of Main Street, and the church bell began to clang in alarm. Grace broke into a run, Jake close behind. They rounded the corner to find Murphy's boarding house ablaze, flames already eating through the roof. A bucket brigade had formed, but the fire had too much of a head start. My guests! Mrs. Murphy wailed, held back by her husband. There are people inside. Jake didn't hesitate. He plunged toward the building, ignoring the shouts behind him. Grace watched, heart in her throat, as he disappeared into the smoke. Long moments passed before he emerged, supporting old Mr. Weatherby, both of them coughing and blackened with soot. He went back in twice more, bringing out a traveling salesman and finally Mrs. Chen, who did seamstress work on the second floor. That's everyone. Mr. Murphy confirmed, doing a quick head count. Thank God, that's everyone. As the fire began to die down, leaving the boarding house a charred skeleton, Grace felt the weight of eyes upon her. The crowd had noticed her presence, and whispers spread like the fire itself. She was here this afternoon, threatened Mrs. Murphy, said there'd be a fire. Which? Pastor Blackwood pushed through the crowd, his face triumphant despite the tragedy. You see? You all see now? She speaks her curses and they come to pass. How much more proof do you need? Now hold on, Jake said, stepping forward. He was still covered in soot, his voice rough from smoke. Miss Turner tried to warn you. I heard her myself from my window. She told Mrs. Murphy to check the chimney. Lies! Mrs. Murphy shrieked. She cursed my home. She wanted to see us burn. Then why? Jake asked quietly. Did she run here to help? Why is she crying? It was true. Tears had left clean tracks down Grace's dusty face as she watched the boarding house collapse. Witches' tears, Blackwood declared. Shed to deceive us, to make us doubt what we know to be true. She has brought nothing but misfortune to this town since the day she darkened our doorstep. The crowd murmured agreement, pressing closer. Grace stood her ground, but Jake could see her trembling. Seems to me, a new voice said, that if the girl warned about the fire, she was trying to help. Doc Harrison pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He was one of the few in town who treated Grace with anything approaching kindness, mainly because she brought him herbs that actually worked. Maybe instead of blaming her for your troubles, you should be thanking her for the warning you ignored. You'd defend a witch, Harrison? Blackwood demanded. I defend sense over superstition, the doctor replied calmly. Now, who needs tending? That smoke can do terrible things to a man's lungs. The crowd reluctantly dispersed to let Doc Harrison work, but the damage was done. Grace could feel their hatred like a physical thing, pressing against her from all sides. Thank you, she whispered to Jake as they moved away from the scene. For going in after those people, for trying to defend me. Don't thank me yet, Jake said grimly. This is far from over. That night, Grace lay wakeful in her small bed. listening to the wind rattle her thin walls. She could still smell smoke on the air, could still see the flames in her mind's eye. But worse than that was the knowledge of what was coming. The fire had been just the beginning. In her dreams, she'd seen darker things approaching Dry Creek, and after today, she knew with certainty that no one would listen to her warnings. Outside, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild. Grace closed her eyes and tried not to think about the blood she'd seen in her visions, or the way Jake Morgan's face had appeared among the fallen. Some futures, she'd learned, were better left unknown, but they came anyway, relentless as the desert sun, and all she could do was watch and wait and hope that someone, somewhere, would finally believe. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, a rare respite from the oppressive heat. The church bell called the faithful to worship, its bronze voice echoing across the quiet streets. Jake Morgan stood outside the saloon, watching the townspeople file into the small white building like sheep into a pen. He'd been debating whether to attend, not from any religious inclination, but from a growing sense that understanding Pastor Blackwood meant understanding the hold he had over Dry Creek. Grace Turner sat in her usual spot at the very back of the church, on the bench everyone else avoided. She came every Sunday despite the hostility, partly from habit, partly from a stubborn refusal to be driven away completely. She'd worn her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to find, and tried to make herself as small as possible. Jake slipped in just as the service began, taking a seat a few rows ahead of Grace. She started when she saw him, unaccustomed to anyone willingly sitting so close. He didn't turn around, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from where his gun would normally rest. Pastor Blackwood ascended the pulpit like a man going to war. His black coat hung on his thin frame like wings, and his eyes burned with fervent purpose. He gripped the edges of the pulpit and surveyed his congregation with satisfaction. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "We gather here in the shadow of calamity. The Murphy boarding house, a cornerstone of our community, lies in ashes. Good. God-fearing people have lost their livelihoods, their homes. And why?" His voice rose to a crescendo. "Because we have tolerated evil in our midst." A murmur ran through the congregation. Grace felt every eye in the place turned toward her, even though most quickly looked away. "The book of Exodus tells us, 'Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live,'" Blackwood continued. "Yet here we are, suffering not just a witch to live, but to walk among us, spreading her poison, bringing death and destruction to our doors." Jake shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Doc Harrison, sitting with his wife near the middle, cleared his throat loudly. But Blackwood was beyond such subtle warnings. "Some among you." The pastor's gaze found Jake. Then Doc Harrison. "Have been deceived by her wiles. You think her warnings are meant to help, but I tell you, brothers and sisters, the devil knows Scripture. The devil can appear as an angel of light. These so-called visions are nothing but Satan's way of sowing fear and discord among the righteous." "Mrs." Henderson called out. "Amen." Others took up the cry. Grace kept her eyes fixed on her folded hands, but she could feel the anger in the room building like a thunderstorm. Her chest tightened, not with a vision this time, but with simple, human fear. "She speaks of blood coming to our town." Blackwood's voice dropped to a dramatic whisper that somehow carried further than his shouts. "Of course she does, for she is the one who calls it forth. Every calamity that has befallen us can be traced to her cursed presence. The drought that withers our crops, her doing. The fever that took the Watson child last spring, her curse. And now, the fire that nearly claimed innocent lives, her witchcraft made manifest." Jake had heard enough. He stood slowly, the scrape of his boots on the wooden floor unnaturally loud in the hushed church. Every head turned to watch as he faced the pulpit. "Pardon the interruption, Pastor," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "But I've got a question." Blackwood's face flushed. "This is God's house. Mr. Morgan, you will show proper respect." "Oh, I am showing respect," Jake interrupted. "Respect for the truth. You say Miss Turner's warnings bring calamity, but seems to me warning folks about danger is what any decent person would do. If I knew a bridge was about to collapse, wouldn't I be obliged to tell travelers not to cross it? You compare earthly knowledge to the devil's work. I compare common sense to superstitious nonsense. Jake said flatly, "That fire started because of a blocked chimney, not witchcraft. Miss Turner tried to prevent it. You're the one who told folks not to listen." The congregation gasped at the direct challenge. Blackwood's hands gripped the pulpit so hard his knuckles went white. You dare stand in the Lord's house and defend that creature?" "I dare stand anywhere and defend an innocent woman against a mob." Jake replied, "Question is, Pastor, what are you so afraid of? If she's just a deluded girl with no real power, why does she frighten you so much?" The silence that followed was deafening. Grace looked up, startled by this defense she'd never asked for and didn't know how to handle. She could see the calculation in Blackwood's eyes, the moment he decided to raise the stakes. "Brothers and sisters," Blackwood said, his voice now deadly quiet, "we have tolerated this evil too long. It is time to cut out the infection before it spreads further. I call upon you now, cast out the witch. Drive her from our town before more blood is spilled." "No." The word tore from Grace's throat before she could stop it. She stood, trembling but determined. "Please, if you'll just listen. There's danger coming. Real danger. I've seen armed men. Riders in the night. They mean to—" "Silence!" Blackwood roared. "You hear how she threatens us? Armed men. She says violence and blood. She promises, cast her out. Cast out the curse." The congregation erupted. Some stood, shouting agreement. Others seemed uncertain, looking between Grace and their pastor. Jake moved quickly, positioning himself between Grace and the advancing crowd. "Anyone lays a hand on her answers to me," he said quietly. And somehow that quiet voice cut through the chaos more effectively than any shout. "You draw a gun in church?" "Mrs." Henderson demanded, scandalized. "I draw a gun anywhere to protect an innocent woman from a lynch mob." Jake replied, "That's what this is turning into, isn't it? Dress it up in Sunday clothes all you want, but I know a mob when I see one." Doc Harrison stood as well, moving to stand with Jake and Grace. "The boy's right. This is madness. Elijah, you're working these people into a frenzy over superstition and fear. Those who stand with evil share its fate," Blackwood warned. "Then I guess I'll take my chances." Doc said dryly, "Miss Turner has helped me heal more folks with her herb knowledge than all your prayers combined. If that's evil, then maybe we need a new definition of the word." Jake felt Grace's hand touch his arm lightly. "We should go," she whispered, "before someone gets hurt." He nodded, keeping his eyes on the crowd as they backed toward the door. Doc Harrison followed, providing additional cover. They made it to the entrance when Blackwood's voice rang out one final time. "You have 3 days, witch. 3 days to leave Dry Creek forever or face the consequences of your evil, and those who shelter you will share your fate." Outside, Grace stumbled, the weight of what had just happened hitting her all at once. Jake caught her arm, steadying her. "Easy now," he said. "Take a breath." 3 days, she whispered. "He's given me 3 days, but the riders, they'll be here before then. I can feel it, the blood, the screaming." She pressed her palms to her temples. "Why won't anyone listen?" Doc Harrison looked troubled. "These riders you mentioned, tell me about them." Grace looked up at him with desperate hope. "A dozen men, maybe more, hard men with cruel eyes. They're coming from the south, following the old cattle trail. I see them striking at night, when the town's asleep, the bank, the general store. They mean to take everything and leave nothing but ashes and bodies behind." "When?" Jake asked sharply. "Soon. 2 nights, maybe 3. The vision isn't clear on time, but I can feel them getting closer. Like a storm building." She laughed bitterly. "But who's going to believe me now? Blackwood's made sure of that." Jake and Doc exchanged a look. "I believe you," Jake said simply. "Question is, what do we do about it?" "We prepare," Doc said. "Quietly. Those of us with sense need to be ready. even if the rest of the town wants to bury its head in the sand. Through the church windows, they could see the congregation still milling about, Blackwood's voice rising and falling as he continued to stoke their fears. Grace pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You should both stay away from me," she said. "He means it, about sharing my fate. I won't have your blood on my conscience." My blood's my own concern," Jake said, "and I've faced worse than a fire and brimstone preacher with delusions of grandeur. Have you faced a town full of frightened people convinced they're doing God's work?" Grace asked. "Because that's what he's creating in there. A holy war with me as the enemy." As if to underscore her words, the church doors burst open and people began streaming out, their face flushed with righteous anger. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you somewhere safe. Then we need to figure out how to defend this town from threats both inside and out." As they walked away, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Blackwood had just lit a different kind of fire, one that would burn through Dry Creek just as surely as any flame, and caught between the pastor's mob and the approaching riders. She wondered if any of them would survive the conflagration to come. The drought had been bad before, but now it seemed like the very earth was punishing Dry Creek. The sun rose each day like a brass coin in a white-hot sky, and by noon, the air shimmered with heat that made breathing feel like swallowing sand. Water barrels ran low, and the creek that gave the town its name had dwindled to a muddy trickle. Grace knelt in the dusty yard behind Doc Harrison's house, carefully tending to the small herb garden she'd managed to keep alive with precious cupfuls of water. The doctor had insisted she stay close after the scene at church 2 days ago, offering a spare room despite the risk to his reputation. She'd accepted only on the condition that she work for her keep. "Fever's spreading," Doc Harrison said. Stepping out onto the back porch, his usually cheerful face was drawn with worry. 3 more cases this morning, the Baxter children and old Mrs. Steinway. Grace looked up, her hands stilling on the wilted sage leaves. "The willow bark tea will help with the fever, but we need more. There's a grove about 3 miles north, near Skeleton Ridge. Too dangerous for you to go alone, not with how folks are feeling right now." As if to emphasize his point, they heard voices from the street, angry, harsh voices discussing the curse that had brought sickness to their town. Grace's name featured prominently in their complaints. "I'll go tonight," she said quietly. "After dark, when you'll go nowhere alone." Jake Morgan emerged from the house, having arrived for what had become his regular morning visit. "I'll ride with you." Grace shook her head. "You've done enough. The whole town's talking about how you've thrown in with the witch. Murphy won't even rent you a room anymore." "Murphy's loss. The saloon's got a cot in the back that suits me fine." Jake crouched beside her, studying the struggling plants. "These herbs of yours, they really help. My grandmother taught me. She had the sight, too. Said the visions came with a responsibility to heal what we could." Grace's voice turned bitter. "Fat lot of good it's done anyone here." "The Carson boy might disagree." Doc interrupted. "That poultice you made drew the poison from his spider bite better than anything in my medical bag. And now his mother crosses the street when she sees me coming." Grace stood, brushing dirt from her worn skirt. "Sometimes I think Blackwood's right. Maybe I am cursed. Everything I touch seems to wither." Jake caught her hand, stilling her restless movements. "That's fear talking, not truth. I've seen cursed things. Grace, you're not one of them." She looked at him, startled by both the touch and the conviction in his voice. For a moment, something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. Then the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. Sheriff Campbell rode into the yard, his badge glinting in the harsh sun. He was a decent man trying to do an impossible job, and it showed in the deep lines around his eyes. "Miss Turner," he said, not dismounting. "Jake, Doc." "Sheriff," Doc replied warily. "What brings you here?" "Just checking on things, making sure everyone's peaceful." His gaze lingered on Grace. "There's been talk, more than talk. Some of the men are meeting at the church tonight. Blackwood's got them worked up something fierce. And what are you planning to do about it? Jake asked, his voice deceptively casual. Campbell shifted in his saddle. I uphold the law. Long as no laws are broken. What about when they decide to break the law? Jake pressed. When talk turns to action, you planning to stand between Miss Turner and a mob? I'm one man with one gun, Campbell said quietly. I'll do what I can, but he trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging heavy in the air. But you won't risk your neck for the town witch. Grace finished for him. I understand. Sheriff, you have a family to think of. Campbell had the grace to look ashamed. I'm trying to keep the peace. Miss Turner, maybe it would be best if you considered moving on, for everyone's sake. Where would I go? Grace asked. This is the only home I've ever known. There's other towns where the same thing would happen all over again. Jake interrupted. Running's not the answer. Sheriff, standing up to bullies and fools is... Campbell's face hardened. Easy for you to say, Morgan. You can ride out any time. The rest of us have to live here. He turned his horse. I've warned you, best I can. What you do with that warning is up to you. After he left, the three stood in silence. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and somewhere a dog barked incessantly at shadows. He's not wrong, Grace said finally. About me leaving. Maybe if I go... The sickness will still be here, Doc interrupted. The drought will still be here. And when Blackwood needs a new scapegoat, he'll find one. Running doesn't solve the problem. Then what does? Grace asked desperately. Truth, Jake said. These riders you've seen, if they show up like you said, people will have to admit your visions are real, that you're trying to help, not harm. If they show up in time, Grace murmured. If anyone survives to admit anything. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Jake and Grace rode out toward Skeleton Ridge. She sat behind him on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, trying not to think about how natural it felt. The rifle across Jake's saddle was a reminder that this wasn't a romantic ride, but a desperate mission. They found the willow grove in a small depression where underground water still kept things green. Grace worked quickly, stripping bark with practiced efficiency while Jake stood watch. The moon was rising when she suddenly gasped, dropping her gathering basket. Grace! Jake was beside her instantly, gun drawn. She pressed her hands to her temples, swaying. They're closer. The riders. I can see them making camp. They're studying a map, planning. Her eyes flew open, wide with terror. Tomorrow night. They're coming tomorrow night. You're sure? As sure as I've ever been about anything. She gripped his arms. Jake, there are so many of them. 15, maybe 20. And they're well armed. Professional killers, not common bandits. Jake's mind raced. We need to warn people. Campbell, at least. Maybe some of the men who still have sense. Who'll believe us? Who'll believe me? Grace laughed bitterly. Blackwood's got them convinced I'm in league with the devil. They'll think I'm lying to trick them somehow. Then we make them believe. Jake helped her onto the horse, his mind already working through possibilities. One way or another, we make them see the truth before it's too late. They rode back through the darkness, the gathered willow bark forgotten in the saddlebags. As they neared town, they could see torches gathering near the church, far too many torches for a peaceful prayer meeting. Jake, Grace said softly, her breath warm against his neck. Whatever happens, I want you to know, I'm grateful for everything, for believing me when no one else would. He reached back, covering her hand with his. Save the gratitude for after we survive this, both the mob and the raiders. But as they saw the crowd of angry faces lit by torchlight, as they heard Blackwood's voice rising in condemnation, Jake wondered if surviving either threat was possible. The town was a powder keg, and between Grace's visions and Blackwood's sermons, someone was about to light the fuse. Take the back way to Doc's, Jake said, turning the horse away from Main Street. I'm going to try talking to Campbell again. Maybe if I tell him about the raiders, he won't listen. Not with Blackwood whispering in his ear. Then I'll make him listen. Jake's voice was grim. One way or another, this town's going to face the truth. Question is whether they'll face it in time to save themselves. As they circled around toward Doc Harrison's house, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow night would bring a reckoning, not just with the raiders, but with the darkness that had taken root in Dry Creek itself. The visions had shown her blood and fire, but they hadn't shown her who would survive. She pressed closer to Jake's back, drawing comfort from his solid presence, and tried not to think about how in all her visions of the coming violence, she'd never once seen herself among the living when it was over. The third night arrived with an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on Dry Creek like a burial shroud. Not a breath of wind stirred the dust, and even the usual chorus of coyotes had fallen silent. Grace stood at the window of Doc Harrison's spare room, watching the darkness beyond the glass with growing dread. The torch-lit mob from the previous night had dispersed only after Sheriff Campbell's intervention, but she could feel their hatred lingering in the air like smoke. Blackwood had given her 3 days to leave town. Tonight was the last night, and she knew he would make good on his threats come morning, if morning came at all. Jake entered quietly, carrying a cup of the willow bark tea. "You need to rest," he said, pressing the warm cup into her hands. "Won't do anyone any good if you collapse from exhaustion." "I can't rest." Her fingers trembled around the cup. "They're coming. Jake, I can feel them getting closer with every heartbeat." "And the town." She gestured helplessly toward the window. "They're all sleeping, sitting ducks in their beds, with no idea what's riding toward them." "I tried again with Campbell," Jake said, frustration evident in his voice. "Told him about the riders, the weapons you described. He thinks I'm either lying to protect you or that you've bewitched me into believing your fantasies." Doc Harrison appeared in the doorway, medical bag in hand. "I've made my rounds, told anyone who'd listen to keep their guns loaded and their doors barred tonight. Most thought I'd been drinking." He sank into a chair, looking every one of his 60 years. 20 years I've served this town, delivered their babies, set their bones, sat with their dying, and not one of them trusts me enough to take a simple precaution." "It's not your fault," Grace said. "Blackwood's poison runs too deep." "Speaking of our illustrious pastor," Jake said grimly, "he's called a special meeting at the church for midnight. Says he's going to lead a cleansing of the town." Grace set down her cup with shaking hands. "Midnight. The riders will strike at midnight." She pressed her palms to her temples as another vision crashed over her. "I can see it now. While Blackwood's got half the town's men gathered in the church, the raiders will hit the bank, the general store, the freight office. Anyone who resists." She shuddered. "So much blood." "Then we stop them," Jake said simply. "How? We're 3 people against 20 killers in a town full of folks who'd rather see me burn than listen to a word I say." Jake checked his weapons methodically. The Colt at his hip, the rifle he'd cleaned that morning, the hideout gun in his boot. "I've faced worse odds. Question is, can you tell me exactly where they'll hit first?" Grace closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus on the vision despite the pain it brought. "The bank. They'll send 4 men to the bank while the others create a distraction on the opposite end of town. Set fire to the old Hutchinson barn to draw people away." "Smart," Jake admitted grudgingly. "Use the town's fear of fire after what happened at Murphy's." Doc stood abruptly. "I'm going to try one more time. Maybe if I catch people at home, away from Blackwood's influence." "No." Grace caught his arm. "It's too dangerous. Once the shooting starts, anyone on the streets will be a target." "Then what do you suggest we do? Sit here and wait for the slaughter?" Before anyone could answer, the church bell began to toll, a slow, ominous rhythm that seemed to echo in Grace's bones. Midnight. The cleansing was beginning. "I have to go," Grace said suddenly, standing. "Like hell," Jake growled, moving to block the door. "Don't you see? If I'm at the church, if Blackwood's focused on me, maybe I can keep them distracted long enough for you to stop the raiders. Maybe I can make them listen one last time." "Grace, no." The rawness in Jake's voice surprised them all. "You walk into that church, you won't walk out. Blackwood's got them whipped into a frenzy." She touched his face gently, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "And if I don't go, everyone dies. The riders, the mob, between them. They'll tear this town apart, at least this way. Some might survive." "There has to be another way." A scream split the night, high and terrified. Then another. The sharp crack of gunfire followed, and suddenly the night erupted in chaos. "They're early," Grace gasped. "Oh God, they're early." Jake was already moving, rifle in hand. "Doc, get anyone you can to safety. Grace!" But she was already running, not away from danger, but straight toward it. Jake cursed and followed, knowing he couldn't stop her and protect the town at the same time. Main Street had become a battlefield. Riders thundered through, firing at anything that moved. Windows shattered, and screams mixed with the sound of horses and guns. The Hutchinson barn was already ablaze, painting everything in hellish orange light. Grace saw Mrs. Henderson stumble from her house, nightgown fluttering, only to fall as a rider's bullet found her. The Garrett boys who'd thrown stones at her just days ago were huddled behind a water trough, crying for their mother. Without thinking, Grace ran to them. "Come on!" She pulled them to their feet, pushing them toward the alley beside the mercantile. A rider wheeled toward them, gun rising, and Grace threw herself over the boys, waiting for the impact. The shot came, but it was the rider who fell. Jake's rifle smoking from across the street. "The church!" Grace shouted to him over the chaos. "They'll fort up in the church!" Sure enough, townspeople were streaming toward the only stone building in Dry Creek, seeking sanctuary. Blackwood stood in the doorway, his black coat making him look like death's own gatekeeper as he urged people inside. Jake was fighting like a man possessed, picking off raiders with deadly accuracy. But there were too many, and more townsmen were falling. Sheriff Campbell appeared, finally doing his duty, rallying what men he could to return fire. Grace got the Garrett boys to safety, then turned back to the melee. She saw a raider bearing down on young Tom Bailey, who stood frozen in terror. Without thinking, she grabbed a dropped pistol and fired. Her shot went wide, but it distracted the raider long enough for Tom to dive for cover. "The witch has a gun!" someone screamed. And suddenly, Grace found herself facing both raiders and townspeople, confusion adding to the chaos. That's when she saw him, the raid leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, directing his men from horseback. In her visions, she'd seen him giving orders, seen him counting the take. Now he was pointing toward the bank, sending his men to complete their bloody work. "Jake!" she pointed, and he followed her gesture, understanding immediately. If they could take out the leader, but Blackwood had seen her too. He strode from the church, Bible raised like a weapon, voice booming even over the gunfire. "See how she stands with the raiders. See how she brings death to our door. Strike down the witch and end this curse." Some of the townsmen, confused and terrified, began to turn their guns toward Grace. She stood in the middle of Main Street, caught between the raiders' violence and her own people's hatred. "No!" Jake's roar cut through everything. He positioned himself beside Grace, guns drawn. "Anyone shoots at her goes through me first." The tableau held for a moment. Raiders on one side, townspeople on the other, and Grace and Jake standing together in the middle of hell. Then Grace did something no one expected. She walked forward, straight toward the raid leader, hands raised and empty. "I know why you're here," she called out, her voice carrying with supernatural clarity. "I've seen it all. The man who hired you, the map he gave you, the promise of easy pickings in a divided town." The leader's eyes narrowed, his gun swinging toward her. "But I've also seen how this ends," Grace continued, never stopping her advance. "Your employer won't pay. He's already gone, taken the money meant for you. You're riding into death for nothing." "Shut your mouth, woman," the leader snarled. "The man with the scar under his left eye, he'll be the first to fall. Then the one missing 2 fingers. Then you." Grace's voice rose, taking on the eerie quality that came with true visions. I see your blood soaking into Main Street. I see vultures picking at your bones. Turn back now, or fulfill the vision. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in the leader's eyes. His men exchanged uneasy glances. In that moment of hesitation, Jake took his shot. The leader tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. His men wavered, suddenly leaderless and facing a prophet who just predicted their deaths with unnerving specificity. "Ride out," Grace commanded, and her voice seemed to echo from the very heavens. "Ride out now, or join your leader in the dust." Maybe it was her words, or maybe it was the increasing resistance from the townspeople, or maybe it was seeing their leader fall. Whatever the reason, the raiders broke. They wheeled their horses and fled into the night, leaving their wounded behind. A stunned silence fell over Dry Creek. The barn still burned, casting dancing shadows. Bodies lay in the street, some moving, some still, and in the middle of it all stood Grace Turner, no longer hiding her nature, no longer apologizing for the gift that had just saved them all. Blackwood was the first to speak, his voice cracking with rage. "Witch! You consort with demons! You—" "Shut up! Elijah!" The words came from Mrs. Patterson, whose laundry Grace had washed for pennies. She stood in her nightgown, a smoking shotgun in her hands. "Just shut up! She saved us! She tried to warn us! And we didn't listen! And she saved us anyway!" Others began to mutter agreement. The evidence was impossible to deny. Grace had known exactly when and how the attack would come. She'd risked her life to save children who'd tormented her. She'd faced down armed killers with nothing but words and faith. Jake reached Grace's side just as her knees buckled, catching her before she could fall. "I've got you," he murmured. "You did it. You saved them all." "Not all," she whispered, looking at the bodies in the street. "If they'd listened." "But they're listening now," he said. "That's what matters." The days following the raid passed in a blur of burying the dead and tending the wounded. Dry Creek had survived, but at a cost. 7 townspeople dead, twice that many injured, and the general store burned to its foundations. The drought continued unabated, and now, with their supplies diminished, the town faced an even grimmer future. Grace worked tirelessly alongside Doc Harrison, using her herb knowledge to stretch their dwindling medical supplies. The same people who'd shunned her now accepted her help with grateful, if shame-faced, silence. But old prejudices died hard, and she could still feel the uncertainty in their glances, the way they flinched when she moved too suddenly. Jake rarely left her side during those first days, appointing himself her unofficial protector. He'd taken a bullet in the shoulder during the fight, a graze. He insisted. Nothing serious. But Grace noticed how he favored his left arm when he thought she wasn't looking. On the 4th day after the raid, Grace woke from an exhausted sleep with a gasp that brought Jake running. "What is it?" He found her sitting bolt upright, eyes wide and unseeing. "Water," she whispered. "I see water, but also—" Her face crumpled with anguish. "The cemetery. Fresh graves. So many fresh graves." Jake gripped her shoulders gently. "The wounded? Are they going to—" "No, not the wounded." Grace pressed her hands to her temples, trying to make sense of the jumbled images. "Disease, something in the water, but also salvation in the water. I don't understand. The vision is fighting itself, showing 2 futures at once." Doc Harrison appeared in the doorway, drawn by their voices. "Disease in the water? Grace, are you certain?" "The well," she said suddenly. "The town well. Something's wrong with it. Dead animal, maybe. Or something worse. People will sicken and die if they keep drinking from it." The doctor's face went grave. "With this heat and drought, fouled water could kill half the town in days. But Grace, that's our only source. Without it, there's another source." Grace stood shakily, Jake steadying her. "In the vision, I saw Jake and some men digging, northwest of town, where that ring of stones sits. Underground river, clean water. That's Josiah Turner's old claim." Doc said slowly, "Dry as dust for 40 years. He went mad insisting there was water down there. Died broke trying to find it. Grace went very still. Turner? Josiah Turner? You knew him? Jake asked. He was my grandfather. Her voice was barely a whisper. The one who taught my grandmother about herbs and healing. I never knew what happened to him. My parents never spoke of him. Doc shifted uncomfortably. Well, he claimed to have visions too. Said the water spoke to him, told him where to dig. Town thought he was crazy as a... He stopped, flushing. That is, they didn't believe him. Just like they didn't believe me. Grace moved to the window, looking out at the drought-stricken town. He died trying to save them, and they mocked him for it. Maybe he was right, Jake said. Maybe you both were. Question is, can we convince anyone to dig based on a vision? Before they could debate further, shouting erupted from the street. They rushed outside to find a crowd gathering around the well. Mrs. Chen was on her knees, sobbing, while her husband held their youngest child, a boy of perhaps 4, limp and burning with fever. Started this morning. Mister, Chen said desperately. Won't wake up, won't take water. More voices rose. The miller's baby was sick too, and old Mr. Weatherby, and 3 of the salvage crew who'd been working to clear the burned buildings. All had drunk deeply from the well the night before, trying to fight the oppressive heat. Doc Harrison immediately went to examine the child, but Grace walked straight to the well. She peered down into the darkness, then recoiled. Something died down there. I can smell it. The water's poisoned. How would you know? The challenge came from Samuel Grant, one of Blackwood's most devoted followers. Unless you poisoned it yourself. Don't be a fool. Grant, Sheriff Campbell said wearily. The events of the raid had aged him 10 years. She's been warning us about the water all morning. Convenient, isn't it? Grant pressed. First she predicts fire, then a raid, now poisoned water, almost like she knows because she's causing it. Or maybe, Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. She knows because she's trying to help you ungrateful. Stop. Grace placed a hand on Jake's arm. This isn't the time. People are dying. She turned to face the crowd. My grandfather, Josiah Turner, believed there was clean water northwest of town. I've seen the same thing in my visions. Mock me if you want, but if we don't find new water soon, the sickness will spread. Turner was insane, someone called out. Spent his last cent digging dry holes. And what if he was right? Grace challenged. What if he was just a few feet away from water when he died? Are you willing to bet your children's lives that he was wrong? The crowd stirred uneasily. Behind them, more families were arriving with sick members. The Blackwood fever, they were already calling it, though the pastor himself was nowhere to be seen. I'll dig, Jake announced. Who's with me? You're injured, Grace protested. I've got 1 good arm and 2 good reasons to try, he said, looking at her meaningfully. Your grandfather's legacy and your vision. That's enough for me. Doc Harrison stepped forward. I'll help. My old bones might not be good for much digging, but I can mark the spot and keep the workers hydrated with what boiled water we have left. One by one, others volunteered. Tom Bailey, whom Grace had saved during the raid. Mr. Chen, desperate to save his son. Even some who'd thrown stones at her before, shamed by her courage during the attack. By midday, 15 men had gathered at the old Turner claim with shovels, picks, and determination. Grace stood at the ring of stones her grandfather had placed, closing her eyes and trying to feel what he had felt all those years ago. Here, she said finally, pointing to a spot just inside the eastern edge of the ring. Dig here. The work was brutal under the scorching sun. Men took shifts, 2 digging while others rested in whatever shade they could find. Jake worked with a single-minded determination, his injury forgotten in the urgency of their task. Hours passed. The hole deepened. 5 feet, 10, 15. Some began to mutter about wild goose chases and wasted effort. Grant, who'd come to watch and mock, grew louder in his derision. Just like old Turner, he laughed. digging his way to madness. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it, witch? Jake climbed out of the hole, sweat and dirt streaking his face, and advanced on Grant with murder in his eyes. Grace caught him just in time. "Don't," she said softly. "He's not worth it, and we need your strength for the digging, not fighting." 20 feet, called Tom Bailey from the hole. Still nothing but dry earth. Doubt crept into the workers' faces. Even Doc Harrison looked troubled. The sun was beginning to sink, and back in town, more people were falling ill. "Please," Grace whispered, though whether to God, her grandfather's spirit, or the earth itself, she couldn't say. "Please, wait!" The shout came from below. Tom Bailey's voice, high with excitement. "The soil! It's changing! It's damp!" The diggers renewed their efforts with desperate energy. 25 feet, 30, and then, "Water! By God, there's water!" A cheer went up from the workers. Jake pulled Grace into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. The water, when they hauled up the first bucket, was clear and cold and sweet. "Your grandfather was right," Doc said, tears in his eyes. "All those years, and he was right." They worked through the night to widen the well and shore up the sides. By dawn, they had a steady flow of clean water. The sick began to recover as soon as they drank, and the town's salvation was assured. But Grace stood apart from the celebration, looking at the stones her grandfather had placed. Jake found her there as the sun rose. "He died believing," she said softly. "Died knowing he was right but unable to prove it. Just like I might have, if you hadn't believed me." Jake pulled her close. "But you didn't die, and now they know. Both you and your grandfather were trying to save them all along." "Some know," Grace corrected. "Others, like Grant, will always find a reason to hate what they don't understand. Then we'll face them together." Jake said simply, "For as long as you'll have me." She looked up at him, this gunfighter who'd chosen to stand with her against odds both human and natural. "And if I have visions our whole lives, if there's always another disaster to warn against, another danger to face, then I reckon we'll never be bored," he said with a slight smile. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get yourself killed trying to save people who don't appreciate it." Pastor Blackwood appeared at the edge of the claim, his black clothes dusty and his face haggard. The gathered townspeople fell silent, waiting to see what the man who'd denounced Grace so virulently would say now. "Miss Turner," he began, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed to choke him. I was wrong. Pride and fear blinded me to the truth. You are not cursed. You are blessed, and through you, we have been blessed. Can you forgive an old fool?" Grace studied him for a long moment, seeing the genuine anguish in his eyes. "I can forgive. Pastor, the question is, can this town learn to listen when someone different tries to help?" "We'll learn, Mrs. Patterson said, stepping forward. "We have to. You've saved us twice now, 3 times, counting the water. Only fools ignore that kind of gift." As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and promise, Grace felt something shift in the air. The drought would break soon. She could feel it in her bones. And while there would always be those who feared her gift, she was no longer alone. Jake's hand found hers, and together they watched the town they'd saved begin to heal itself, one bucket of clear, sweet water at a time. The storm rolled in at sunset. 3 days after they'd found water, Grace had felt it coming since dawn, a prickling in her skin, a heaviness in the air that spoke of change. She stood on the porch of Doc Harrison's house, watching the clouds mass on the horizon like an advancing army. "Never seen clouds that dark," Jake said, joining her. His shoulder had healed well, leaving only a faint scar to mark the night of the raid. "Almost looks angry." "It is angry," Grace said softly. "All this drought, all this heat, it's been building to this." She shivered despite the warmth. "I've been having visions all day. Water rising, the creek overflowing, the dam." "What dam?" Jake asked sharply. "The old earthen dam upstream. Hodgins built it years ago to irrigate his failed wheat crop." It's been holding back what little water the creek still carries." Grace pressed her fingers to her temples. "In the vision, I see it breaking, all that water rushing down at once. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that shook the windows. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, and within moments, it became a deluge. "We need to warn people," Jake said, already reaching for his coat. They ran through the rapidly flooding streets, pounding on doors and shouting warnings. Some listened, those who'd learned to trust Grace's visions. Others were too drunk on the joy of rain after months of drought to pay attention to talk of danger. Sheriff Campbell met them at the jail, water already ankle-deep in the street. "Dam's not my jurisdiction," he said, but his face was worried. "That's county land up there. Jurisdiction won't matter if it breaks." Jake said, "How many people live along the creek bed?" "Maybe 24 families. The Crowleys, the Bakers, all of Tent City where the miners' widows set up." Campbell grabbed his hat. "Hell. All right, I'll ride up and check the dam. You two get those people to higher ground." But Grace caught his arm. "No, don't go to the dam. There's no time, and you'll be caught in it when it goes." "When? Not if." "When?" Grace confirmed. "Before midnight. I've seen it." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we evacuate. Every soul near that creek bed." What followed was organized chaos. Through the driving rain, they went door to door, convincing, cajoling, sometimes physically carrying people to safety. The Garrett boys, who'd once thrown stones at Grace, now helped their mother gather belongings because "Miss Grace says we gotta go." Old Mr. Weatherby refused to leave until Jake simply picked him up and carried him, cursing all the way, to the church on high ground. Pastor Blackwood had opened the church doors wide, welcoming everyone regardless of past grievances. "This is what I should have done from the start," he said to Grace as she brought in a group of terrified children. "Open doors instead of closing hearts. Just keep them calm." Grace said, "It's going to get worse before it gets better." The rain intensified, turning streets into rivers. Lightning struck so frequently that the night seemed like a continuous, stroboscopic day. Thunder rolled without pause, and the wind howled like a living thing. "That's everyone from Tent City," Tom Bailey reported, water streaming from his hat. "But the Crowley place, they wouldn't come. Said they've weathered storms before." Grace closed her eyes, seeing again the vision that had plagued her all day. The oak tree, the big oak by their barn, it's going to fall, right onto their house. "I'll go," Jake said immediately. "We'll go," Grace corrected. "You'll need me to convince them." They fought their way through the storm, the rain hitting like bullets, the wind trying to tear them apart. The Crowley farmstead sat in a depression near the creek, already flooding. The massive oak that had shaded their barn for 50 years groaned ominously in the wind. "Get out!" Grace shouted, pounding on their door. "You have to get out now!" Robert Crowley yanked the door open, his face furious. "You brought this storm, witch, just like you bring everything else." "I didn't bring it, but I'm trying to save you from it!" Grace had to scream to be heard over the wind. "That tree is going to fall. Your house will be crushed. Please, Robert, your children." "Don't you talk about my children?" Jake had heard enough. He pushed past Crowley into the house, where Mrs. Crowley huddled with 3 young ones. "Ma'am, with respect, we're leaving now." "You can't just," Robert began, but his words were cut off by an enormous crack. The oak, ancient and weakened by drought, began to topple. "Run!" Jake grabbed the youngest child while Grace pulled Mrs. Crowley, Robert, finally understanding, swept up the other 2 children. They made it 20 yards before the tree crashed down, obliterating the house they'd just fled. In the brief silence that followed, Robert Crowley looked at the ruins of his home, then at Grace. You saved us." The words seemed torn from him. "You saved my family. That's what she does," Jake said quietly. "No matter how you treat her." They had no time for more conversation. A new sound was rising above the storm, a roaring that made Grace's blood run cold. "The dam," she breathed. It's gone. The wall of water came like a living thing, carrying trees, debris, and destruction. They ran for high ground, Robert Crowley carrying his children with newfound strength. Behind them, the flood devoured everything in its path. They made it to a rise just as the water surged past, missing them by mere feet. In the lightning flashes, they could see the devastation. Buildings swept away. The new well they dug swallowed by mud. The cemetery where Grace's grandfather lay buried underwater. My home, Robert said numbly. Everything I built. You're alive, Grace said. Your family's alive. Everything else can be rebuilt. They made their way back to the church, where anxious townspeople waited for news. The building was crowded with refugees, but the atmosphere was different from that terrible Sunday when Blackwood had preached hatred. Now people made room, shared blankets, offered what comfort they could. Is that everyone? Doc Harrison asked. Doing a head count? Wait, Grace said suddenly. Where's Grant? Where's Samuel Grant? A quick search revealed he wasn't in the church. His house sat perilously close to the creek, and in their haste to save others, they'd forgotten the man who'd been Grace's most vocal tormentor. Let him be, someone muttered. He made his bed. No. Grace was already moving toward the door. No one gets left behind, not even him. Grace, don't be a fool. Jake caught her arm. The man hates you. He spent months trying to turn the town against you. And that means he deserves to die? Grace pulled free. That's not who I am. That's not who we are. Jake stared at her for a moment, then sighed. You're going to be the death of me. Woman. He grabbed a rope from the supplies. But if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. They went together into the storm once more. Grant's house was half submerged, the water still rising. They found him on his roof, clinging to the chimney, terror etched on his face. Grant! Jake shouted. Grab the rope! Grant saw them and his face went through a series of expressions. Relief, recognition, then something like shame. Grace, you came for me. Less talking, more grabbing. Jake threw the rope. It took 3 tries in the wind before Grant caught it. They pulled him through the water to safety, all 3 of them exhausted by the time they reached solid ground. Grant collapsed, looking up at Grace with bewildered eyes. Why? He asked. After everything I said, everything I did, because that's what neighbors do, Grace said simply. They help each other, even when it's hard, even when they disagree. Grant began to cry, whether from relief, exhaustion, or shame. It was impossible to tell. Jake hauled him to his feet. Come on, let's get you to the church before we all catch our deaths. The storm raged all night, but by dawn, the rain had softened to a steady patter. The sun broke through the clouds, revealing a transformed landscape. Dry Creek lived up to its name no more. The creek ran full and strong, carving a new channel through the valley. The town was damaged but not destroyed. The flood had taken buildings, but not lives. Every soul was accounted for, saved by the warning of a woman they'd once called cursed. As people emerged to survey the damage, Grace stood with Jake on the church steps. She looked exhausted but oddly at peace. The drought's broken, she said. I can feel it. The land will heal now. And the town? Jake asked. Will it heal too? Before Grace could answer, Samuel Grant approached, his clothes still damp and muddy. He stopped before Grace and, to everyone's shock, dropped to his knees. Forgive me, he said. I was wrong, blinded by fear and prejudice. You're not a curse. You're a blessing. The preacher called you a curse, yet your warning was our only hope. I see that now. Grace helped him to his feet. There's nothing to forgive. We all do things from fear. What matters is what we do next. What I do next, Grant said firmly, is help rebuild this town and make sure everyone knows what you've done for us. One by one, others came forward. The Crowleys, the families from Tent City, even those who'd been slowest to trust. Each had a story of how Grace's warnings had saved them. Pastor Blackwood cleared his throat. I believe it's time for a new sermon. One about gifts we don't understand, and the courage to use them for others, even when those others don't deserve it. He looked at Grace. Would you stand with me this Sunday? Let me try to undo some of the harm I've done." Grace looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll stand with you, Pastor. We'll all stand together." As the sun climbed higher, drying the flooded land, the people of Dry Creek began the work of rebuilding. But they were rebuilding more than buildings. They were rebuilding trust, community, and understanding. The sun rose over a transformed Dry Creek 6 months after the Great Flood. Where once there had been dusty streets and withered hopes, now green shoots pushed through fertile soil, and the creek ran clear and steady. The town had not just survived, it had been reborn. Grace stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse, watching children file in for their morning lessons. Among them were the Garrett boys, who now greeted her with shy smiles instead of stones. The town council, in a unanimous vote led by Samuel Grant, had asked her to teach the children about herbs and healing, practical knowledge that could save lives. "Miss Turner," little Amy Crowley ran up, clutching a handful of wildflowers. "These are for you. Papa says you're the best teacher ever." Grace accepted the flowers with a smile that transformed her face. At 21, she no longer looked haunted and hollow. Purpose and acceptance had brought a glow to her cheeks and a lightness to her step that Jake never tired of seeing. "She's right, you know," Jake said, appearing beside her as the children settled into their seats. "Best teacher this town's ever had, among other things." He wore a sheriff's star now. Campbell had retired after the flood. Recommending Jake as his replacement, it had been another unanimous vote. The town felt safer with a man who'd proven he'd stand against any threat, whether it came from raiders, nature, or their own prejudices. "Flattery before noon," Grace teased. "What are you after, Sheriff Morgan?" "Just stating facts, Miss Turner." His expression grew more serious. "Though I did want to talk to you about something." "Walk with me?" They strolled down Main Street, nodding to shopkeepers and townspeople who called out greetings. The new general store was thriving. The hotel that had replaced Murphy's boarding house was full of travelers drawn by tales of Dry Creek's miraculous water and equally miraculous profit. Even Pastor Blackwood seemed years younger, his fire and brimstone sermons replaced by messages of community and compassion. Jake led her to the cemetery on the hill, now carefully tended and protected from future floods. They stopped at a new granite marker. "Josiah Turner, visionary, water finder, beloved grandfather. The town council approved it yesterday," Jake said. "Figured it was long overdue." Grace knelt, running her fingers over the carved letters. "He died thinking he was a failure. Called mad and cursed, just like—" She trailed off. "Just like you were." Jake knelt beside her. "But you both saved this town. Him by never giving up, you by never giving in." He pulled something from his pocket, a small velvet box. "Which brings me to what I wanted to ask." Grace's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring with a small turquoise stone. "Grace Turner," Jake said, "you've already seen our future in your visions, but I'm hoping you'll let me be part of it anyway. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she laughed. "You know I didn't see this in a vision." No, some futures." She touched his face gently. "Some futures are too beautiful to spoil with knowing in advance." She kissed him softly. "Yes, Jake Morgan, yes, I'll marry you." They were married a month later in the church where Grace had once been condemned. Pastor Blackwood performed the ceremony, his voice strong with conviction as he spoke of love that conquers fear and faith that moves mountains. The entire town attended. There wasn't an empty seat or a dry eye in the house. Doc Harrison gave Grace away, beaming like a proud father. Mrs. Patterson, who'd once paid Grace pennies for laundry, had sewn her wedding dress with her own hands. The Garrett boys served as ushers, taking their duties seriously. Even Samuel Grant stood as one of Jake's groomsmen, their unlikely friendship forged in flood and redemption. As they exchanged vows, Grace had a brief vision, not of disaster this time, but of joy. She saw children playing in a yard, Jake with silver at his temples still looking at her like she hung the moon. A town prospering under their care, She saw herself, older but still strong, teaching a new generation that different didn't mean dangerous, that gifts came in many forms. "Do you, Grace Turner, take this man?" Pastor Blackwood was saying. "I do," she said, coming back to the present, to Jake's beloved face and steady hands. "With all my heart, I do." The celebration lasted well into the night. Tables were set up in the street, laden with food and drink. The town's new musicians played, and couples danced under stars that seemed especially bright. Grace found herself passed from partner to partner, each person wanting to share a word, a blessing, an apology, or simply a smile. "Never thought I'd see the day," old Mr. Weatherby said as he spun her carefully around. "The witch of Dry Creek, married to the sheriff and beloved by all. Shows what an old fool knows, eh?" "You weren't a fool," Grace said kindly. "Just afraid. We all were, in our ways." As midnight approached, Jake reclaimed his bride for a final dance. Around them, the town they'd saved celebrated not just a wedding, but a new beginning. Where once there had been drought, water flowed. Where once there had been suspicion, trust grew. Where once there had been a curse, now there was only blessing. "Regrets?" Jake asked, holding her close. Grace thought of all the pain that had led to this moment, the years of loneliness, the stones thrown, the accusations made. Then she thought of the lives saved, the town reborn, the love found in the most unlikely place. "No," she said firmly. "No regrets. Every vision, every hardship, every moment of doubt, they all led here. They all led to us." "The preacher called you a curse," Jake murmured, echoing the words that had once condemned her. "Yet your warning was our only hope. Turns out he was half right." "Oh, you were our only hope. Just took us a while to see it." As the church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another, Grace Turner Morgan looked out at her town, for it was truly hers now, as she was truly theirs, and felt perfect peace. She didn't need visions to know that Dry Creek would prosper, that children would grow up knowing that differences were strengths, not weaknesses, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as curses. The girl who'd once been pelted with stones now stood surrounded by love. And in that transformation lay the true miracle of Dry Creek, not the water found or disasters averted, but the discovery that fear could become faith, hatred could become love, and a curse could become the greatest blessing of all. In the years that followed, travelers passing through Dry Creek would often remark on the town's unusual harmony, the way people looked out for one another, the respect shown to those who were different, and always, someone would tell them the story of Grace Turner, the woman with visions who'd saved them all, not just from drought and flood and raiders, but from the darkness in their own hearts. The preacher called her a curse. The story always ended, yet her warning was their only hope. And Grace, teaching children or tending her garden or walking hand in hand with Jake down Main Street, would sometimes feel those old visions stir. But now, when they came, the town listened. Now when she warned, they heeded. Now when she spoke of danger or promise, drought or plenty, they trusted. For Dry Creek had learned the greatest lesson of all, that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, and the very person you push away might be the one meant to save you. They'd learned it in fire and flood, in blood and tears, but mostly, they'd learned it in the quiet courage of a young woman who'd refused to let their fear define her, and in doing so, had helped them all find the best in themselves. The curse had become a blessing, and Dry Creek would never be dry again. Thank you so much for listening to this story, friends. I hope Grace and Jake's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, love, and redemption from the American frontier. What did you think of Grace's gift and the town's transformation? Share your thoughts. I read every comment and love connecting with fellow Western story enthusiasts.